So, biggest question
Yes.
for James Stewart, by far, is Canadians or Maple Leafs?
Ah. Well, Boston Bruins? Just kidding. No, I guess I'm partial to the Maple Leafs. I've been in Toronto long enough.
I was going to say, but I mean, Quebec is very much part of your world.
It is. Yeah, Montreal. I was born and bred in Montreal.
So
But
when
the Canadiens were so dominant that I tended, maybe because of my dad, to always sort of look for the underdog, to hope for the underdog. So I never became as strong a Canadien fan as you might think, having lived in Montreal on the eastern townships of Quebec. So having moved to Toronto long ago, I've sort of adopted the Leafs. But
they haven't quite had the same
no,
tradition.
actually, to be honest with you, for some reason I've always liked Detroit.
Huh?
So I mean, if the Leafs aren't there, well, let's sort of hope for Detroit.
Ironically, my daughter is an attorney with the Detroit Tigers,
Ah.
and the owner of the Detroit Tigers is Mike Ilitch, who's also the owner of the Detroit Red Wings.
Right. Wow.
Small world. Were you destined to get into this sort of international criminal law?
Not at all.
What's the career path?
Well, I mean, I sort of backed into law because I didn't want to teach French, which I was studying at the time. I didn't think I had much of a head for business. But I thought, well, I'll go into law. My grandfather was a lawyer, but I always thought law would be very dry. When I got into it at the University of Toronto, I really enjoyed it. And criminal law was always what interested me. And I was very lucky because I got to know through friends who were involved themselves some really very fine criminal defense lawyers. The principal one being a man by the name of Arthur Maloney, who had a tremendous impression, made a tremendous impression on many of us, and influenced us a great deal. Now, in the end, of course, I went through law school and I articled for a very fine criminal defense lawyer, Robert Carter.
What does that mean? Is that like an internship when you say article?
Yes, at that time to complete your professional training, you had to do a year of what we called articling. In other words, working for a lawyer. So I was very lucky to work for Robert Carter, who's now deceased. So is Arthur Maloney, for that matter. But anyway, to make a long story short, I got into. I started working with the Ombudsman at the time. That was Arthur Maloney. I worked for the Ombudsman for 2 years, and then went into the downtown Crown Attorney's office in Toronto. And that's where you learn fast on your feet, because you're in court all the time. You don't have a lot of time to prepare, and there's a big volume of cases, and you see the underbelly of the city in which you live. But I mean, I loved that work. I went from the downtown Crown Attorney's office into an office called the Crown Law Office Criminal, which dealt with organized crime, white-collar crime, but principally criminal appeals. And I worked there from 1985, and it was when I was there that I got the opportunity to go overseas to work at the Rwanda Tribunal, International Criminal
How
Tribunal
did
for
that
Rwanda.
just happen?
Not exactly. I speak French,
Okay.
and part of my education was Laval University in Quebec City. And I took cases along with one or two other of my colleagues before the Court of Appeal for Ontario in French. And one of the judges who sat on our cases was Justice Louise Arbour. And when she became prosecutor of the Rwanda Tribunal and the Yugoslav Tribunal, I met her at a big function. It was a retiring Chief Justice, and there were about 1,000 lawyers there, and I was there, and I saw her, and I congratulated her on her appointment, because I knew her as a counsel, having appeared before her, and I just couldn't resist asking her, do you need any prosecutors? And she said, I don't know, we'll talk. This was all in French. So a few months later, I had occasion to speak to her, and she said there must be some kind of mental telepathy going on, because she had been thinking of me. Because of my language abilities and because of the background I had, she said, would you ever consider working for the Rwanda Tribunal? Well, of course, in that instant, I was already taken, but I had to sort of square it with my family. But that's how I got into it. I thought I was going to go to Kigali and work in Arusha in Tanzania for a year. It went to 2 years, and then I left there to go to the Yugoslav Tribunal for 3 years. Thought I was done with that, but a few years later I applied for and got the position as Senior Appeals Counsel back at the Rwanda Tribunal, this time in Arusha, and did that for 3.5 years, went back to my Crown Law Office criminal, thinking that was the end of it. I had a friend who worked, I met in the Rwanda Tribunal, who wrote me an email and said, "Have you considered applying for the position of Deputy Prosecutor at the ICC?" And that's really where it started.
What drew you to that? I mean, here Fatu had been just appointed,
Right.
and obviously she was the deputy, so
Right.
therefore the vacancy. How does it work?
Well, I mean,
How do you apply?
well, that's a good question, because the process for me was a completely alien one. You apply, and
I mean, to fill out a form. I mean,
yes, there's a frightful form that you have to go through. I think it was up till 3 in the morning filling out this thing online. It was a horrendous thing to do, but anyway, I got through it, and what happens there is you go through. I went through 2 interviews along with other candidates, and in the end, under the statute, the Rome Statute, Fatu has to pick 3 candidates. And she picked 3, and I was one of them. And she presented them to the Assembly of States parties, which then had to make a choice. And you had to get, I guess, just an absolute majority. At the time, it would be 61 out of 121. There were only, at that time, 121 states parties. So I needed to get 61 votes. But of course, at the Assembly of States parties session in November of 2012, only about not quite 90 states parties actually came. So that it wasn't a question of getting sort of 50 plus votes. You had to get 75% of the votes. So it took a little while, but eventually it happened. So I got the news that I had been elected deputy prosecutor on the same day that my wife became a Canadian citizen. So it was a bumper day for us and our family.
What was she?
Kenyan.
Kenyan.
She is Kenyan, but she has adopted Canada as her country.
Does she understand this whole crazed international criminal law world that you're a part of?
I think she does, because we met in that crazed
did you?
international
Okay.
criminal law world. She's not a lawyer, but she's a highly competent administrative assistant, and so we met. We met in fact in The Hague. She was working. When I met her, she was working at the Rwanda Tribunal, but when I came up to The Hague to work with the Yugoslav Tribunal, she was in the Yugoslav Tribunals, and she had just left the Office of the Prosecutor to go into Chambers. So she understands very well, but she has a rule: when we have guests, there's no shop talk.
Yeah.
There's none. If she catches me speaking about something that at work, I'm called to order very quickly.
For example, if I just picked this off the web, fighting carries on as Hamas backs Palestinian push for ICC Gaza Pro. Is that the kind of thing that you get asked about?
Well, I don't get asked about it so much in my position as deputy prosecutor, but of course all of this swirl of speculation and comment is part of the environment in which we function. So we attempt essentially to keep a very neutral and objective perspective, and to deal in a very low-key way with these issues.
So it's, I mean, as much as this is out there, you have to be in a reactive mode as opposed to a proactive mode?
Well, in this sense, we obviously prepare for various eventualities within the office. But in terms of being proactive and sort of going out to get business, if you will, we don't take that position. I think perhaps in the early days of the court, the previous prosecutor may have been of that perspective for very good reasons. But in our situation, we are very busy anyway. But I think we respond if something comes to us as a court. It's true that the prosecutor has the ability to act on her own motion with the permission of a pretrial chamber, but at least to this point, she's not used that power, And even her predecessor used it very, very sparingly. We've only got one case today, which is a result of an intervention that the prosecutor did on his own motion, the previous prosecutor did on his own motion, with the authorization of a pretrial chamber. That's the Kenya situation. So we tend to take the cases that come to us. So in that sense, I suppose we're reactive, but of course we can see sometimes what's coming. So we attempt to prepare, at least psychologically, and make some dispositions within the office in case.
What's your role?
As deputy prosecutor, well, essentially I sometimes think of myself as the anchor in The Hague, because the prosecutor is called upon to travel a great deal. She plays a vital diplomatic role. She has access to heads of state. She's the one who goes to the Security Council to report on the cases, or the situations, I should say, that have been referred to the office by the prosecutor, by the Security Council. So she has a very high-level role to play. She is the face of the OTP. So I think for her, it's important to have somebody who's quite happy to sort of work out of the limelight and to run things, if you will, on her behalf, and of course keeping her fully informed, run the office at home. So my job as deputy prosecutor is to manage the three great divisions in the office: the Jurisdiction, Complementarity and Cooperation Division, or JCCD as we call it, the Investigations Division, and the Prosecution Division. So they are under my oversight, my supervision, if you will, and the heads of those divisions report to me and through me to the prosecutor. But we're not that formal in terms of our hierarchy. It's a much more flexible kind of interaction. But that's my responsibility. So that's really what I do, is to manage on the prosecutor's behalf those three divisions through the heads of division. But it's a more flexible operation than that. I get involved in specific cases depending on the issues, particularly if they're very sensitive issues. There's a lot of things that I'm involved with sort of day to day, but generally it's the big initiatives and the general oversight of how the office is operating.
Do you get in the court much?
Not much. I always sort of smile at Fatu when somebody's going to make an initial appearance and say, well, they need me. And she said, oh, no, you should come. So I always go there and sit, and all I ever say is, good morning to the judges. So I see some of these things, and they're very interesting to watch, of course, initial appearance. But it's rare that I go into court to act as counsel, and when I do on those rare occasions, of course, it's a great pleasure, because that's what I did for many, many years of my life, and I enjoy the courtroom. I like being there. So I was involved recently with the team prosecuting in the Ruto and Sang case, when we submitted to the trial chamber that it had the power to request the government of Kenya to compel witnesses who were reluctant to come to The Hague to come to a location in Kenya to testify either by video link or before the trial chamber sitting in Kenya. And that was a technical issue, but also one that's very important to the case, which I thoroughly enjoyed being involved with. But there again, we had filed a very good written material. I think the trial chamber didn't really need to hear that much from us. We got a very short space of time to make submissions, but it was enjoyable. So that's as one example. And on one occasion, which I can't talk about too much in a closed session, something happened in the court that was reported to me, and I went down. I put my robes on and went down to address the chamber, because I felt the chamber had to do something. And they did respond positively to my submission, but essentially I went in to back up my people. So they were happy to see me come down. So it's rare that I do go into court, and I do miss the court, but I also enjoy what I do.
Your term is for how long?
9 years.
9 years? So is it coterminous with Fatu's?
Not exactly. Hers is 9 years from, I guess, the middle of June of 2012, and I started on the 8th of March of 2013. So I go to the March the 7th of 2022, and I guess her term will finish sometime before that.
Are you back and forth? I mean, do you get to Canada much, or are you in The Hague principally?
I'm in The Hague principally, but we're in Canada now. I mean, I'm in the United States at the moment, but my wife and I flew to Toronto, and we have our oldest son is our elder son is up in the bush in Ontario, and we're going to go and pick him up from camp on the Labor Day weekend. So we have things to do in Canada, but I think I've been back once a year, roughly once a year.
Did your paths cross with Robert Petit?
Yes, Robert Petit was one of my colleagues in the ICTR. It's a very small family doing this kind of work. Yeah. So I mean, I started in the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and I came in after Robert was there. So he was based in Kigali, as I was, but I was mostly on mission in Arusha because we were running the trials. I was a senior trial attorney in charge of the team running the trials in those days. So yes, I had lots to do with Robert.
One of the things that strikes me, the United States has an awful lot of, in their law schools, international criminal law programs, Washington, Case Western, Syracuse, Vanderbilt, among others that are here, training international criminal law lawyers. Also, and a place to put interns was in the existing tribunals. Well, they're wrapping up, and the ICC, the United States, is not a party to. It doesn't preclude you from grabbing some people, but they're not going to get up in the hierarchy if we're not a party to this. So what's a message to a young law student who wants to go into international criminal law, especially if you're in the United States?
Well, not to be discouraged, because there is place for good Americans in the ICC. We have excellent Americans in the ICC. It may be that the United States government, for various reasons, has not has not ratified the Rome Statute and is not a state party to the Rome Statute. But the passion and commitment for international criminal law that Americans have is obvious, and I've worked with Americans in every international tribunal I've been in, and valued the sort of can-do approach that they have, and the discipline and excellence that they bring to the endeavor. So we do look for good Americans, and we have Americans, of course, in some very senior positions in the prosecution division, for example. It is a sensitive point, though, that you raise, because there is a point beyond which it becomes very difficult for Americans. I mean, an American obviously could not run for prosecutor or for deputy prosecutor. These are elective positions. An American couldn't be a judge. These are all elective positions that the Assembly of States Parties deals with. And even at the most senior level, we would probably draw a great deal of criticism from states parties to the Rome Statute if we put an American in that position. But they are pretty close to the top, I can say, at the senior trial lawyer level, for example, and they bring a great contribution to the work we do. But I mean, who knows? In time, things may change. Right. I know there's what people call American exceptionalism, and the concern not to lose sovereignty, and I suppose a sense of creating a unique society and not wanting to be encumbered, if you will. And I suppose perhaps a concern about how the court might be used in a certain way, and I think these are concerns that over time may dissipate as the court builds up its record, as it performs, as it becomes, well, I hope it is, and that is a very reasonable, professional, law and evidence-driven institution.
Ambassador Intelman, who was the United Nations head of the Assembly of States, painted a, I guess, optimistically, a kind of a mixed bag picture of the ICC today. If you had to get up and they said, all right, James, you want to respond to the ambassador? What would you say?
Well, first of all, I'm an admirer of Tina Engelman, and I think she is very honest and well-motivated and capable president of the Assembly of States Parties, and I don't think she's had an easy job. I think her term has been a pretty turbulent one in some ways. I suspect that she's very conscious of the deterioration of many situations in the world and the challenges that an institution like the ICC faces, and the criticisms and the pushback, if you will. But I think, speaking to her afterwards, I think she believes passionately in the worth of the endeavor that we're engaged in, but also, as I do, realizes that to some degree it is still a fragile endeavor. Bad things can happen, and you really have to have your wits about you and your eyes wide open in this business. And I think perhaps that's maybe what's troubling her. So I think we have to believe in what we're doing. We have to be optimistic that we can accomplish a great deal. At the same time, we have to realize that there are minefields out there, and people with the best of intentions want us to walk into those minefields. And if we have to walk into them, we're going to have to be very alert.
The African Union situation, for lack of a better term, do you get a sense, that, as I heard from Fatou today, that that's getting better, or is there a large rift that still needs to be bridged?
Well, none of these organizations are monolithic. So the African Union would I suppose present in its membership a spectrum of attitudes. Some very hostile, and others very supportive. The members of the African Union tend to be fairly quiet. Those who support the court, with the notable exception of Botswana, which has always spoken up for us. But the silent majority, if I can call them that, are very strongly supportive of the ICC. They see its value, and they provide to Fatou the reassurances that she needs. But there is a vocal minority, of course, which could make a lot of noise. But I think one can't be dismissive of the concerns that are expressed. One has to examine what the concerns are and address them to the best of one's ability and give the reassurances that are necessary. Of course, there is a certain level of self-interest and perhaps hypocrisy involved in some of the positions that certain people will take within the context of the African Union. But there are other concerns that are voiced that need to be addressed, and I think we need to work on that. But I think what Fatou is referring to, and I think very correctly, apart from what I've just mentioned, this sort of support that is given to her and to our operations, we are making a real endeavor to engage with the African Union. To the seminar that was attended very recently in July in Addis Ababa was very valuable. It was a so-called technical seminar, but when you get a technical seminar, what it means is you work on a technical level, but how does the ICC work? What are the criteria we apply? What are the issues that we deal with? It allows people to engage with us in a way that's not so politically charged. And there's also, to a degree, an ability to engage and demonstrate that we are doing things which are of real interest to the African Union. One of the cases that we have arising out of Darfur, probably the only one that may actively go to trial if the accused shows up on the summons to appear that he's under in November, is the case of Banda. And this is a case where the victims were African Union peacekeepers whose encampment was overrun in Haskanita. So here's a case where we need support from especially states parties whose troops were involved, and the ability to take advantage of a technical seminar like that in order to make contact with people and to reach out to them and get them to understand how important it is that they cooperate and assist us is invaluable.
Right.
So we really are working on many different levels to engage with the African Union. I think we must. I mean, all of our cases right now are involved with the continent of Africa, with states in Africa. We're bound to engage with them, and we hope to do so in a respectful way that overcomes some of these difficulties.
The ICC is the permanent tribunal, and many see that as a direct linkage from the Nuremberg trial. We're here at the Robert Jackson Center sponsored event. What does Robert Jackson mean to a James Stewart?
Well, he's an inspiration, and I can say that because, well, for a number of reasons. For one thing, last year I had the opportunity to visit the Nuremberg. I was involved in a conference. I don't get involved in too many of these things, but I was involved in this particular one, and with my family, we toured the marvelous museum that's been set up sort of behind. It's part of the complex, the court where these trials were held. So, of course, it brings you back right into connection with that time. But the other thing is that I remember very well. In fact, I watch from time to time, just because I enjoy it, that wonderful movie Judgment at Nuremberg with Spencer Tracy. And what comes across in a film like that, but I think also, frankly, in the efforts of a person like Robert H. Jackson, is the fundamental decency of the democracy, if you will, of the culture, the democratic culture that's been developed in the United States, in Canada, in other countries of the same persuasion, if you will, and the notion of right and wrong and what just can't be. So to me, that kind of moral but also very pragmatic approach to things is right. And so I enjoy learning about a person like Robert Jackson because he had that sense of, what's right in the world. You just can't do some things, and if you do, then there's going to be an accounting. And the notion that you will have an accounting in a reasonably serene environment in which evidence is presented and people's voices are heard, as opposed to simply grabbing a bunch of people, lining up against a wall and shooting them and saying they're good riddance, is valuable. The other thing too that impresses me is the way the young Germans at Nuremberg, who take you through the display there, are so committed to the notion, and how, in an interesting way, they've taken this dreadful episode in their history and sort of turned it around and said, this is something that we've experienced that we want never to experience again, and we don't want anybody else to experience it, and therefore we are in the front line of this international criminal law. And Germany, of course, in terms of its support for the ICC, is vital. And I worked, as I told you earlier, very happily with American prosecutors, but I used to sometimes say, when I was at ICTY and we were hiring people, I'd say, let me see the Germans, because my experience was so good with German prosecutors. And one of my closest friends, the best man at my marriage to my wife, was a German prosecutor. He's a German prosecutor today, but he was on my team in Arusha. And his father was killed in the Netherlands fighting with the Wehrmacht. My father was in the Canadian Army in the Netherlands during the liberation of the Netherlands. And here we are, a German and a Canadian, fast friends working in the same endeavor. So people like Robert Jackson have played a pivotal role in that sort of evolution. And to me, I can relate to it.
What did you expect when you were told that you were coming here?
To the Robert Jackson?
Well, to this event.
To this event? Well, I had some sense of, I expected, first of all, a beautiful setting, because I'd heard about Chautauqua. I expected to see a lot of people I knew, because this is, as I said before, a small family. I wasn't quite sure just exactly how the events would be organized. So I was very open to sort of see, well, let's see what's going to happen. And so far, it's been very interesting and very enjoyable, as a matter of fact. I think at this stage, I'm listening a lot. I want to hear what people are saying. And of course, I get a chance to sort of have heart-to-heart talks with people like Brenda Hollis, for whom I have a great deal of respect and affection, and with whom I feel I can speak very frankly. So that it just helps. It helps you in your thinking, in your planning, in what you're going to advise the prosecutor to do, or to how she, ideas to present to her. So
this is great. And by the way, our 30 minutes is almost up, and I bet
Good.
they're still out there having reception.
Let's hope.
Thank you, James. This has been.
Thank
terrific.
you very much.
By the way, I suppose one final question. You're at a cocktail party. Your wife says, "Don't talk about it. Anything.
Right.
No shop talk." Inevitably, somebody's going to come up to you and ask you a question.
Right.
What is the most frequent question you get asked?
Well, I don't. I have to be honest with you. The people I frequent. If I'm in a reception, it's different because my wife expects that even though you're in these diplomatic receptions, you're working all the time.
Oh, sure.
So the big question, of course, would be about the budget, or about this and that. So you're always worrying about that. If we're at home, of course, people know what I do and have always taken an interest in it. I mean, at home in Canada. But in the small circle in The Hague, for example, it's just a kind of a rule. You leave that at the door. It's not so much a cocktail party, but you leave that at the door.
Mm-hmm.
I can't think of a question, like a sort of a common question. I mean,
Here's one I'll give you.
all right.
You're previously in the Toronto
Crown Attorneys?
Crown Attorneys. So you're working in the city of Toronto. How do you advise Mayor Ford?
I don't. As a Crown prosecutor, I'd probably, well, actually, given the kind of trouble he's gotten into, I probably would have nothing to do with it. But no, I wouldn't advise Mayor Ford. But it is sometimes, I sometimes say, look, in Canada we live in a big blank. CNN, BBC were never mentioned, and then Rob Ford, and then there he is, and you think, well, is that really why you want to get into the news?
Yeah.
And I'm also living in the Netherlands, which is also, interestingly enough, I look at BBC and they've got the weather sort of patterned up on the screen, and there's never Amsterdam. And I think, it's great. I've gone from one sort of big blank to another small blank, and you're sort of just under the radar. You can do your work. No one's going to bother you. It's kind of nice. But no, I wouldn't. It's sometimes a bit embarrassing. Let's put it that way.
A bit, my guy. But it's been good humor for every comedian in the United States.
It's really been fodder.
In fact, we've missed him. Now that he's in rehab, we miss him.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.